To set up for this next step, you will need a set of gouache paints. You could also use acrylic or watercolor. You'll just need to water the acrylics down if you do choose to use those. I have a 24 tube set of Reeves gouache that I'm going to use, but I'm just going to pull out 5 or 6 colors that I'd like to use in my final piece. I'm going with magenta, a violet, an ochre, a yellow, a vivid green, and then a cobalt blue. I'm going to use the blue with the magenta to create my shadow colors, my darker colors. Just feel like that gives a much richer shadow than a pure black. You'll also need some water, a palette for mixing, and then something that you can test your paints on. Gouache is very similar to watercolor paint. You just add as much water as you need to kind of change up the opacity of what you're painting. You can get a lot of mileage out of a tiny little daub of gouache. So if you like painting with watercolor out of the tube, then I would definitely recommend trying gouache. It does give more of a matte effect instead of more of the glossy sheen that a watercolor may give. But it's a nice paint to try out if you've never tried. Gouache is really good for layering colors. However, if you don't blend them while they are wet, then you can't really go back and blend over top. So I'm starting here by just testing out some of my colors. This is the cobalt blue and then the magenta that I'm going to use for the portrait. And I'm just testing to see how opaque and how transparent I can get the gouache before I actually start. Typically, when I am instructing my students, I tell them to start out with the highlights and then work into their shadows. So with this piece, I am going with a really light wash over all of the lighter areas in the painting. So I'm starting out with the magenta, and you'll notice that it really just kind of brings out the background because the background has that same color family in it. And I'm going to work through and work on all the highlights that I see. This is where it really comes in handy when you have an image that you're working from that has well-defined values. Once you have your highlights painted in, then you can start adding some of your midtones, just putting on layers to start developing your value throughout your portrait. Work around your portrait. Don't stay in one little spot and finish that before you move on to another spot. This way your gouache paint has time to dry in between the layers. I am using a round brush as I paint. I have more of a small detail brush and then a bigger round brush to cover the washes. And you'll notice again that I'm working through where some of my shadows start to form. I'm just adding value and working around the portrait. Now I'm staying with this one magenta color before I move on to another color. Once you're happy with how the base or the wash of your portrait is, then you can move on to adding some more colors in. You could also approach this piece as a monochromatic piece and just use all, one color family throughout the whole image, or one color throughout the whole image. I'm going with a purple. I'm using that violet and that cobalt blue a little bit mixed together to give this kind of a deep bluish violet color. I'm going to add that to some of the darker places in my portrait, and just to add a little bit of a pop of color. The key to making this a successful portrait is to work back and forth and to continue to add layers until you are happy with the outcome. I have, as you saw, I added a little bit of green to my magenta, and so you know that red and green are complementary colors. When you mix them together, you're going to get a more neutral color. Sometimes it'll look pretty muddy, but you can mix these shades to get a nice shadow effect. And so I'm just going back over the glasses now with this darker tone. I did test it out before I put it on the final piece, just to make sure it was a color that was going to work with the general color family that I'm using. So again, just continue to work back and forth. Finish up one area and then pick up or finish one spot of color, and then go back to another spot of color until you're happy with the shadows and the highlights. the image I'm working from is black and white. And so I'm really free to be creative and decide what I want my colors to look like. And so one thing that you can always do whenever you're trying to have a vibrant piece of artwork and use a lot of color is to use complementary colors. So I have this kind of purpley magenta wash on the face, and now I'm going to add yellow and like an ochre goldish color to the hair. So it's going to keep it really light like the image shows, but it's going to contrast really well with that purple in the face. Once you're happy with your main features and the face, then you can move on to whatever else is in your actual composition. So I have this shirt that has a really large neckline, and I want the shirt to end up being green, but I'm going to start with a darker kind of underpainting here. And again, I'm using my tester page just to see what the colors are going to look like. Also, at this point, you can decide how much paint you want to add, because you are going to go back and add chalk pastels if you would like to finish up the painting. But go ahead and work around your portrait to add or make sure that you have filled in all of your large areas of color, and then you're going to start just really kind of fine-tuning your painting. When you do that, I would suggest to use a small brush and to, kind of pick out where you need to bring out your shadows, where you need to really strengthen your highlights, and again, work around your portrait until you're finished.